Welcome back to the Runner Zone. Chris, what do you think of the new music? What are your thoughts? We have new tunes.
The new music to our intro. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
It snaps me back to when I used to skate, and it's sort of, I don't know, like No Effects, Operation Ivy. It sort of has that kind of flair to it. That I'll throw the Descendants in there.
Yeah.
Maybe Social Distortion, who
Yeah.
my brother used to date a woman who used to date the front man to Social Distortion. So
Man.
yeah, I mean, you chose it. I thought it was a great
Yeah.
pick.
What
Yeah.
it makes me think of the Tony Hawk video games from when I was a kid.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I thought it was, yeah, I've liked it.
I saw him
Cool.
really quick to
Yeah.
interject. I saw him and I'm like, man, I'm getting old. He was doing some kind of commercial where he's skateboarding and he lands on his knees and he's talking about like age-related changes. And I'm like, man, it seems
Disc
like
injections or
yesterday.
something. Yeah.
Well, it was like some turmeric-based,
Yeah.
nutraceutical. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking, man, it seems like yesterday he was doing like, half pipe maneuvers and spins, and here I am, and now I have gray in my beard.
Yeah. All the people that were, really good for the Chiefs when I was a kid, so like early to mid 90s,
Yeah.
they all do promotional stuff for like testosterone supplements now. And so you've
Oh
got all
no.
these guys that were like, these idols when you were a kid. The Chiefs weren't, they weren't as good as they are now when I was a kid. But that's all they do. They'll be talking about joint replacements or, the pillow that they need
That's
to
funny.
use to sleep on at night. And like, yeah, this is definitely different. Well, yeah. So, and we've got a new format. So we touched a little on this last time, but we've got some new sections in the podcast, some things that we're going to be doing kind of moving forward. First, like, what have you been up to, man? What have you been reading? How's life like? What's going on?
Life is good. 2025 got off to a strange start, and I won't bore people with it too much, but um, yeah, what am I reading? I've been going back and reviewing a lot of the literature related to lower limb tendinopathy. Um, you know, I've always am reading the stuff on bone stress injury just because that's so much of my caseload now, and I feel like since the pandemic, there's just been such an uptick where people who you wouldn't typically expect to get BSIs are coming in with BSIs.
Hmm.
So and I think folks' schedules have just gotten out of whack, or their rhythms. Um,
Yeah.
what am I reading right now? I'm reading Brad Culp's book on the Norwegian method, which you would love, man. Have you heard of it
Oh,
or come?
I
Because it
haven't. I'll have
talks
to check it out. My people.
You'll love the beginning. Yeah. Well, it talks about, how a lot of their culture is sort of a driving force. And, they get into, some of the history of the Vikings, who are bad people, man. Like they were
Yeah.
like rugged as hell. But what was interesting is that they were very sort of nimble by sea in their boat
Hmm.
designs and, man powered travel was really what made them so lethal. But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
early on into that, and yeah, I've
Cool.
really enjoyed it. How about
Yeah,
you?
they didn't have any crops. That's why they turned to boats because it's hard to grow, seriously, because it's hard to grow stuff in Scandinavia.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
they became fishermen and all those kind of things. So yeah, funny story. So I've mentioned before, my dad was born in Norway. My grandma grew up there, and so I still have family back over there. But my oldest, who's 9, and my mom, when he goes over to her house now, they go through Norwegian lessons together.
Cool.
So my dad grew up there for a little bit, so he knows how to speak, and so my mom's been learning, and I've been trying to learn too. I only know a few words, but hopefully I'll get some more. So yeah,
Yeah.
so we were sick all last week, so it was a little bit of a mess in the Carlson household, but otherwise all good. This is a little busier time for me with high school kids that I train at work, and but yeah, that's been about it. Just trying to keep my kids in school and not getting sick all the time. I'm on the second book of what's called the Likeness trilogy. It's by James Islington. So the book that I'm reading is called An Echo of Things to Come. It's been really good. And then I've been going back and reading the literature on apophyseal injuries.
Hmm.
So you'll see those in kids, in high school kids and middle schoolers. And so I've been going back through that and working on some things for it. So, but that's been good.
Let's stick with that
Um,
theme for a second.
sure.
Yeah, so I just had a kid come in the other day, and I think this is a really important case, and we can sort of unpack some of our thoughts on it. But um, high schooler, all right. So he's a senior this year, just turned 18 years old, and this past fall, he started off with cross country, and he was doing well. He went into the season. He didn't just like completely unplug over the summer, and things were going well in August, the first couple weeks of September, and then he started developing some proximal anterior thigh pain. All right.
Hmm.
Not groin pain. He said that one time he went to kick a soccer ball and that didn't feel good, but he definitely sort of had a suboptimal season. He ran a 15:01. He said it was on a flat course. So, but he had a couple races that he wasn't able to run, and he just said like his training went to pot. And I saw him 2 days ago, and I started asking him some questions like we always do, because we need to really understand all the moving parts. And I said, tell me what was going on in the fall. And he's like, I just, I don't know. I didn't run up to my abilities. And I started asking some personal questions, and, he was like, yeah, I go to sleep at midnight. I get up around like 7:30 to 8. I have a late pass, which somehow allows him to start school
Hmm.
perhaps a little bit later. Maybe it's a benefit of being a spring semester senior. Doesn't eat in the morning, right?
Hmm.
So basically goes to school fasted, will eat, a light lunch, and then he's going into training. In terms of some libido questions or morning erections, like doesn't get them, and you're like, okay, differential. You're like, is this a proximal femur bone stress injury,
Hmm.
or is this an apophysitis? Imaging,
Hmm.
he had an X-ray, wasn't remarkable, and he was given a script for an MR and was told
Hmm.
to get it if his situation got worse. Now, fortunately, he's training now consistent and healthy, which makes me think it was a rec fem apophysitis, but
Yeah.
I don't think people have these on their radar, and they need to be, right?
I think that's when you really need to know your locations. So know where your typical presentations are. I think with running that's really important. So, if I'm dealing with a high schooler and they report, pain in their shin or pain in their groin, or there's just these patterns that you're like, this is presenting more like bone. If they're
Hmm.
presenting with Achilles tendinopathy or patella tendinopathy, then again, that those tend to present in a very typical manner. But it's the same thing with apophysitis, where you can get it in your iliac crest, you can get Seaver's disease, which is in the heel, you can get a bunch of different ones, but having that as a differential diagnosis and being able to figure out, is this the growth plate or is this the bone that's reacting? Because you're going to treat them different, right? So like with that individual,
For sure.
they can recover relatively quickly with these, but if it's a bone stress injury, it's obviously going to take a lot longer. So I think for
Mhm.
clinicians, if they're working with runners, knowing the typical presentations is really important. So when you see something different, your sensors go up, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah. And I told his mom accompanied him to the appointment. I said, look, the fact that, you know, he's back running and he went through all the physical performance tests. So he was tolerant of side plank with a non-involved leg, abducted, adductor plank, pogo jump, single leg hopping, zigzag hopping, no reluctance, no pain. I said he probably was dealing with an apophysitis. And
Hmm.
it's going to be a self-limiting thing to an extent. We need to keep tabs on his workloads, but also, you know, there are some wellness factors that it would be
Yeah.
remiss of us not to address. Like, if he's training, we got to get him fueled. And I gave them Becca's information.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, people always say, "Oh, I'm a night owl." I'm like, "Yeah, but you're 18 years old. Get your ass to
Yeah.
sleep."
You got to go to bed, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing with clinical care. I think sometimes we want to have all the answers, and when really it's just you just want to know what the right decision is at the time, even if you don't know what it is that someone might be dealing with. So we talk about this all the time when it's we need to get imaging.
Mhm.
I don't feel like I don't need to know if someone has pain in their hip or groin, whether it's coming from the lesser trochanter, the femoral neck, the femoral head, pick the
Yeah.
spot. I just need to know what that looks like and to figure out that we need imaging. So we need
Yeah.
imaging and you need to be on crutches or you need to be doing only pain-free activities. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to have this specific diagnosis. You just want to know what the right decision is at that time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you make. It's like we're in the business of pattern recognition. I think that sometimes clinicians get a little bit, overconfident in saying like, "Oh, well, it's the lesser trochanter." I mean,
Yeah.
you've had people, I'm sure, that present with, vague proximal thigh pain. It's like it could be the femoral neck,
I don't
it
know.
could be the compressive side, the tensile side,
Yeah.
it could be, um, the acetabulum, the
Yeah.
lesser trochanter. Like there
Yeah.
but you talked about this. I forget. Oh, it was in one of your Instagram posts where femoral neck versus femoral shaft, and I thought the way you laid that out was slick. You know, people with the femoral shaft often won't have pain with hip flexion, hip IR to the extent
Hmm.
that you would see. So I think in that case, yeah, it's going to get you thinking a little bit, differently about the location of the lesion. But yeah. Here's another case, sticking with this theme, if we can. Um, a guy I work with who's a physician, lifelong endurance athlete. He's like, "Hey, my son was sprinting. He's playing baseball and they're doing sprints, and he developed some acute proximal posterior thigh pain.
Yeah.
What runs through your head as a clinician? Because I
Avulsion,
advised him,
avulsion
and
fracture.
yeah,
Avulsion
yeah,
fracture.
bam.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I said, "Look, you're a physician. Can you get him in for an X-ray? Because,
Yeah.
you know, but I said, is he having pain sitting, walking?" He said, "No, he's lifting. He's doing everything." I said, "It's probably not an avulsion fracture, but, if he's not continuing to trend in the right direction, like we want to at least get an X-ray and then, perhaps get an MR. But if he's deadlifting and doing stuff
Yeah.
like that, I would say it's probably not an avulsion fracture."
All good signs. Yeah, that
Yeah.
it goes back to like know the populations you work with and the things that they tend to
Hmm.
present with. So like if someone like that comes in and they say I've had a gradual onset of proximal hamstring pain with running, and it's a high schooler, I don't think they have proximal hamstring tendinopathy. I think they probably have an
Yeah.
apophysitis,
Yeah.
because you just don't see PHT in that age demographic. Just like
Yep.
if someone comes in and they say, I have a hamstring strain, but it's very high. If a high school kid
Mhm.
comes in and says something like that, where like the pain is very proximal, that's not the spot I would expect someone to pull their hamstring. I'm worried
Yeah.
more about the growth plate or something,
Yeah.
an avulsion fracture, something like that. So I think knowing your demographics and what they tend to present, like most of the people we see, they have a typical clinical pattern that they present with. Not
Mhm.
everybody. We get some red herrings in there. But I think you want to know, okay, this is the age, this is in the sport, this is what they tend to deal with, and be on the lookout for that. And when things present differently, then you want to obviously treat them appropriately.
Yeah. I'll throw one more case in the mix because there's an influencer online in the running space, and he had reached out, and he was concerned that he was maybe dealing with a proximal femur bone stress injury of some sort, and he had ramped up his mileage. He had recently moved. He's on the gas. I see all the content that he's producing, and um, you know, said, "Hey, like, can I talk to you, or can I ask you a few questions?" I'm like, "Sure." And he said, I've been running significant mileage a week. I've lost a little bit of weight. I've had
Hmm.
a couple of these other things come up that I just mentioned, like, relocating. And, I said, okay, I started asking some of the questions that you'd want to know specific to men in terms of shaving frequency, morning erections, general energy availability, history of bone stress injury, la, la, la. But his symptoms, like when I said, show me where he basically pointed right at um, the greater trochanter, you know,
Hmm.
and I'm like, it's low likelihood. You've never had a bone stress injury. You're
Yeah,
lifting,
it's a
you
weird
know,
spot.
it's a weird spot. And, I think, you know, when we think of greater trochanteric pain, glute med tendinopathy, greater trochanteric pain syndrome, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I generally call it glute med tendinopathy. I told him, I'm like, that's kind of like you're pointing right at that greater trochanter,
Hmm.
and he's not saying the pain's getting worse with running. He's able to single leg hop, which I don't always have people do if I don't know what's going on. But yeah, I mean, that's a diagnosis that you generally tend to think, okay, perimenopausal woman
Right.
between say 45 to 63, if you look at the literature. But I remind people, men can get this injury
They can get
too.
it too. I've had
Yeah,
the same thing in my clinic where someone comes in and like you don't fit the demographic, but you're presenting just like it.
yeah. And I think the incidence is 18% in men. So it's just one of those things. This is why you need to read the literature and you need to understand practice patterns, right?
Hmm.
And the only
Yeah,
way you're
for
going to
sure.
do that is if you're in a clinic and you're seeing this stuff,
Practicing.
frequently. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cool.
We've got a course in Boston. We haven't talked
Hmm.
about this coming up. If people are interested, you can learn more in the show notes. So this is our Bones, Tendons, Weights, and Whistles course. It's a 2-day course. We're going to be at Soul PT. Should be pretty fun. So I'm excited. This will be our first one of 2025.
Yeah, the Northeast is a good place to do it. There's a bunch of people that we have in our network, so it'll be a good group. Um, and we love taking people down the rabbit hole of this stuff. But also, I think people always, I ask folks after the courses that we teach, like, what did you find helpful? And it's always, you just give us very practical, actionable information that we can go into the clinic on Monday and implement. And I mean, uh, if you come away from that course and you identify, you get better at managing these things from a load standpoint or identifying things. I
Yeah.
mean, if you catch a femoral neck bone stress injury, you're saving someone. I mean, if you look at the NIE study, $100,000. Like that's what it costs the military if they have one of their personnel incur a femoral neck bone stress injury. So it's also a reminder for fee-for-service providers to take up their damn rates
Make
because,
sure you're charging enough.
value what you do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Make sure you're charging
So,
enough. Yeah, it should be pretty good. If anybody has any questions, feel free to message Chris or myself. And again, you can learn more about it in the description. We've got a new section to the podcast. We didn't. This is our first time doing it. This is called Solopreneur Corner. So the
mhm.
goal is to give you a little bit of content or answer a question around running your own show, whether you do that now or you're thinking about, hey, maybe someday I want to do this. And so we're going to start with what's one tip that you would give clinicians for if or when they go out on their own. If you could just give them one thing to start doing now when they're maybe working for somebody else, what would you tell them?
Tell them who you are, what you do, where they can find you, and uh, that you are thinking about going out on your own, so long as you're not in violation of a contract. Well, here, let's say this: don't sign a contract. You
Yeah.
know, uh, and I know that you want to have an agreement with parties if there are two parties coming together for something, but people sign their life away sometimes, and most of the time these are not enforceable, but it gets into muddy water if you do. And we sign contracts when we teach, just to
Hmm.
basically make sure that both parties are invested. But um, yeah, I think tell people what you do, where they can find you, and because they're going to go search your name anyway, and the journey begins.
Yeah. Yeah, so mine would be the same thing. Get yourself out there before you go out on your own. I think starting to work in your local community and you have to, if you're working for somebody else, you want to make sure you're respecting your employer. But
Hmm.
people go to people. They don't go to businesses so much when it comes to PT. And so developing relationships is really important. I would start producing content and things that you think are helpful before you go out on your own. Now, I would, again, make sure that your boss is okay with that. I had my website before I started my business. So I bought runningmatekc.com like 3 years before I went out on my own. And I started writing blogs and putting videos up there, and I have my contact information. Now, at the time, the contact was, hey, call this number to schedule with me at the clinic, or something along those lines. But I would start working on that stuff early, because that's how people will go and check you. And it helps you figure out your unique voice, which I think is one thing that is a rarity right now. I think almost everybody, when we're talking about social media or other ways that they try to engage in their community, people just copy each other. And there is an element of, that's how you learn how to do things, is by mimicking. You got to figure out how to talk for yourself. And I would encourage people to like answer the questions that your community asks you when they see you in the clinic, and make it in your own words. Don't just copy what I do, Chris does, other people do. Don't do the same videos as everybody else. Like, figure out a way that you can answer the question that the people ask you. And I would start doing that early, because it's going to make it easier if you ever get the opportunity to go out on your own, to not start from nothing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have relationships now, people that refer me, people that, you know, they referred to me in 2012. So like, it's been years now, and multiple other jobs that I'll still get people that'll send people to me. And I think that if you can start that process early, it's a good idea.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, when I was at NISMAT, I was just constantly shooting content, and just putting it out there because I enjoyed it. I had no intentions of ever trying to monetize. It was just stuff that
Yeah.
piqued my interest. I thought I had a unique lens or take on something as simple as like how you ice the knee after an ACL reconstruction, you know, which, um, yeah. So, and also, you got to get solvent straight away. We see people incurring so many expenses. There are so many free no code tools that there's no reason to start incurring debt, which you're going to have to address at some point if you're running a business. There's a
Yep.
great quote like, if you're in business, the whole goal is to, treat expenses like fingernails. You got to keep cutting them, right?
Yep.
You got to keep trimming them. So,
Yep.
um, and we could do a whole series
Yeah.
of um, basically providing advice from a lot of our mistakes more than anything else. But I think that's where people get into imposter syndrome. I always find it interesting. People are like, yeah, I feel like I'm an imposter. I'm like, you can't be an imposter to yourself.
Yeah. Just be
So
yourself.
if you're being yourself, you're good,
Yeah. And
Um,
nobody cares. Nobody's going to pay attention. And that's
yeah,
okay. It's the same thing with you or I. Like, nobody
yeah,
is tracking what you're doing, what you're saying. If they are, they're a stalker, and you wouldn't care about their opinion anyway.
yeah,
So start putting stuff out there, even if you just do it for yourself and you don't ever publish it, because
yeah,
it's a practice, right? Like, you're gonna get better at communicating your message if you consistently do that, even if it just stays on the notes app on your phone. But start working on it.
yeah. And
Um,
don't be an asshole to people online.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
like,
Don't get
be
into arguments.
cordial. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm calculate with my swearing, but sometimes I see people posting things on. I'm like, you're sitting behind a keyboard flexing. Come on, like,
yeah,
imagine if this person were right in front of you,
yeah.
and you can challenge people and you can actually critique people. People critique us all the time, and it's just basically
Mhm.
free. It's a free user experience or feedback.
Yeah,
So I'm always like, just rip any content, and like anyone who's listening to this, you have our permission moving forward to just rip it apart. That's why we're putting it out there, to poke holes, and we take that feedback and infuse it back into the stuff that we're trying to produce or create.
yeah, yeah. Cool. So our question for today, for the episode, is, what do you struggle with in the clinic? So it's going to be
Yeah.
broad.
Yeah.
Um, couple things. What are the things that you currently have a hard time with in the clinic?
Yeah. Well, I think that we deal with a lot of lower limb tendinopathy and bone stress injuries, and it's getting people to embrace the uncertainty and the volatility of their situation. But the thing that is so freaking frustrating to me is I'll have someone come in where, they have, I mean, everything is pointing to a bone stress injury,
Hmm.
and I feel like we have, a pretty good working knowledge of this stuff. I mean, I know this is a huge, professional focus for you. But you can have all the information, knowledge, be up to snuff on all the literature, and someone just goes out and completely disregards everything that you say, but then they come back and you're
Yeah.
like, hey, this is exactly what we discussed. I was concerned about happening, and you sort of threw caution to the wind, and now you're coming back and you're telling me that your situation's worse, and I told you this is what we want to avoid, and they act like this is the first time they're hearing it, and I'm just like, that's what frustrates me, as a clinician. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
how about you?
so you stole one of mine. And so I wrote my newsletter last week was on what do you do if how do you handle patients that don't take your advice?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
basically all around that. And it can, because it's super, super easy as clinicians, especially if you go out and you work on your own, there's like, there feels like there's this extra pressure to perform because you're the only person, you're it, right?
mhm,
You're the whole business. And so, when someone doesn't follow along with what your recommendations are, that can certainly be frustrating. And so trying your best to say all I can do is present my perspective and listen and do right by the person, but at the end of the day they're going to do what they want to do. And so that still is, and the reason why I wrote that is because that's still a frustration for me. And I know there's a lot of clinicians that feel the same way, where you're trying to do right by the people in front of you. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to take your advice, and when they don't, it can feel a little bit of it like a shot at your ego, or your personal brand or your business. And so that's not an easy thing to deal with, for sure. The other one that I would add is I still have a hard time when people won't communicate. uh
yeah, so
where
frustrating.
Because you'll get people that'll ghost you, or they'll fall off your list, and you'll think everything is going well, and then all of a sudden it's like bam, they won't, you don't hear anything from them. And so I think that's still a frustration for me, even though I know that there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. Maybe they're fine, maybe something happened in their life, like, you don't know. But those situations where people aren't necessarily communicating anymore, those are still frustrating for me. That's probably the other one,
Yeah,
aside from maybe not taking my advice.
yeah, yeah. It's fun. I can just think of a handful of people right now that I've consulted recently, and I'm just like, I almost feel like I need to record the whole session and send it to
Hmm.
them. So when they're like, yeah, that's weird. I'm surprised I'm getting pushback. I'm like, go back to the tape, you know? So, but you have to be careful of how you navigate that conversation, because you don't want to get into he said, she said, right?
Right.
Um, so, or, it's like you send someone this very detailed follow-up email where, you spent, significant time really thinking about how to map out their care, and you send it to them and you just don't hear anything back. I'm like, hey,
Yeah.
did you get my email? And they're like, oh yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Or the
You're
better
like,
one is
oh
when you do all that, and then like you get a check-in in like 6 months, and the
yeah,
patient says, I actually didn't do anything that you told me to do. I found this one account online, and I've been
yeah,
doing their stuff, and I feel great now. You're like,
yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Fantastic.
so frustrating.
So
Oh man,
that's working with people, though.
yeah.
Not always. It's not always an easy thing to do, but that's okay.
Cool. Yeah, I enjoy talking about this stuff because I don't feel like I can unload on anyone else except, as you always say, like your spouse, right?
Yep.
And she's just like, you're talking about PT again? La la
Yeah.
la la la.
Yeah. My wife's the same way. That's
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. You got to have
So
people that you can talk to that aren't just your spouse or your significant other. Um, Well, cool. Well, that's all we've got for today's episode. If people have cases or questions that they want us to address, we now have a separate email account. So you can email any of those questions to podcast@runningmatekc.com. You'll also find that in the show notes. So if you've got stuff that you'd like our perspective on, we'd be happy to share our thoughts. And if you find these episodes helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you gave us a review and shared with a friend. That's how this grows. That's how we can keep doing what we're doing. And we'll see you all in the next episode.
Sounds good.